this opportunity and for this great partnership. I am very honored and very happy to be here today with all of you celebrating the voices of the community. I am happy to share with you today our perspectives as the two of my favorite guests we identify as Mexicans and immigrants to this country. And as a representative of Artes de México in Utah, which mission is to build communities and a sense of belonging united by cultural connections through the appreciation and creation of art, because we believe that art in all its expressions is a pathway to reflect on our past and our present and to find commonalities among each other. And that's what we are doing today. Today, we will reflect on historical and current perspectives based on the objects that are part of the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts. And we invite you to reflect on how we interpret these objects as Mexicans and as immigrants. And we invite the community to look at what these objects of the past represent to the relevance of today's as being women. Thank you all. And with that, I would love to give the word to Luke.
Good evening. Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction and the chance to talk with you this evening. Slide, please. The Utah Museum of Fine Arts Ancient Mesoamerican Gallery has many layers, and you can go into that gallery searching for a specific culture, a specific time period. And the collection was really the brainchild and hope and dream of our founding director, Frank Sanguinetti, who over 20 years, starting in the early 1970s, built a Mesoamerican collection, collecting pieces of art from Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, in the belief that the art from ancient Mesoamerica was just as important in teaching the residents of Utah and the University of Utah in the history of art as European art, as African art, and as Asian art. And as Utah has become far better diverse today, it is such a great, he created this wonderful collection for everyone to enjoy. For tonight's talk, my short talk, I just want to focus on one layer of the gallery, because if you go into it, you'll be able to see a diversity of sculptures and depictions of indigenous ancient women representing various stages in a woman's life, from young womanhood to motherhood to elder. So next time when you visit the gallery, I hope these will catch your eye. Slide. Now, while Mesoamerica extends from the northern border of modern-day Mexico to Panama, the small selection I want to speak about tonight all come from cultures that lived within the borders of modern-day Mexico. They include examples from the Nayarit culture of West Mexico, the Tlactolco culture from the Central Valley of Mexico, and the Remojadas culture near Veracruz. These cultures date back to as early as 2000 BC for the Tlactolco, while the Remojadas flourished from about 100 to 800 AD. And the images of women and fertility were a very big part of their art and culture. But sadly, as you're hearing the terms that I'm giving you, Remojadas, Tlactolco, Nayarit, they all sound modern. And that is because they are not ancient terms. They are modern terms that anthropologists and archaeologists have come up with based on geography. We do not know what these three cultures actually called themselves. They did not leave behind written records, nor did contemporaries like the Maya or later the Aztecs record encounters with them. But in some cases, with like the Aztec and Tlactolco, that was nearly 1,000 years between them. Slide, please. For the earliest set of sculptures, I'm showing you a map of the Aztec Empire. And this is not a mistake. These objects come from areas that the Aztecs would eventually control during their time of empire. But the Aztecs were also very important because they're the first ones to actually discover the objects, these art pieces. As they started to work the lands and fields, they started to come across small figurines and images of women. Now, areas like this were given the Nahuatl name Calactico, which can be translated as place of hidden things. Many times the Aztecs would gather these up and take them as offerings into temples. Slide, please. During the Aztec era, as well as modern times, figures like these too were found in a variety of places. The shape of the women suggested fertility, but sometimes they were found in odd places like burials, leading to a bigger mystery or question. Were they perhaps a hope or a prayer for a rich afterlife for that deceased person? We do not know. The second major context was that the figurines like these acted almost as boundary posts for fields growing maize and other crops. What we do know about these people is that those who created these works of art first came into the Central Valley of Mexico around 2000 BCE, and they're the first ones to farm and plant and farm maize on a very wide scale in the area. The images of the female figurine were perhaps that hope or prayer for fertile fields, for productive fields. Because if the fields and earth are not fertile, then life and new life would be very difficult. These figures come some 500 years later. They were produced by hand, as you look at them, and they're produced in rather sizable quantities. But they weren't just mass produced, they also had great attention to detail. If you look at the painting of the faces and the head, but also start to look at the figures, the attributes on the figures, especially the one on the left with her ear spools and outstretched hands. Look for those attributes as we move through the centuries. Slide, please. Now we go west to ancient West Mexico, where we have the cultures we now call Nayarit, Jalisco, and Colima, and is based on the areas that the sculptures and art have been found in and continue to be discovered to this day. Unlike the Tlatelolco culture, there were relatively few reported finds from this region until the late 1800s. Interest in the region really took off, and the sculptures themselves really took off in the early to mid 20th century with the first excavations, but it was also interest on the parts of artists like Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. Diego Rivera himself was mesmerized by these sculptures coming out of the ground in ancient West Mexico, and he loved them so much because he felt like, unlike the art of the Maya or Aztec, these seemed to depict the common people, mothers, fathers, grandparents, babies, the ones who came before, and he felt this was a very important part of pre-Hispanic Mexico. Slide, please. Now, the ancient cultures from Colima and Nayarit and Jalisco all practiced for about 600 years, what was called tomb shaft burials. The elites of these villages in the area would create about 5 to 20 foot long shafts, vertical shafts, usually above their houses. And this would be for a one-time or multi-generation burial. And tomb figures and other gifts would accompany the dead. Now, a lot of debate and theories revolve around the identity and the purpose of their figures in solid, semi-hollow, and hollow figurines that were buried with the bodies. Some revolve around the idea of deities, or the statues or sculptures representing the ancestors of the deceased person. But the type and variety and the actions they are engaged in show the people, the models rejoicing, eating, having a good time, perhaps suggesting the one last meal with the deceased person. Unfortunately, as I said in the introduction, this practice died out about 600 years before the Aztecs arrived or would have even met the people in the region. So this kind of just remains mystery to this day why they practiced this. But next slide, please. But one of the more popular theories is that the depictions with the buried people were representing friends and family of the deceased. So here we're possibly looking at a female relative or a friend of a person from 2,000 years ago. As I said, the representation shows both women and men enjoying, like a feast, an activity. This one, the standing woman, is holding a cup. You can also see the attention to detail that on the face and on the body, where you can even seem to make out the patterns on the woman's skirt. Slide, please. Many examples are of solo women, but you do also get couples, man, woman, husband, wife, which we assume husband, wife. There are some examples of Nayarit and Colima sculpture where they're literally joined at the hip, but here they are separately standing. So they could be husband, wife, they could also be brother and sister. Next slide, please. Now, I include this hollow example from the Colima culture. It is not in our collection, but I wanted to include it because the idea of, in terms of art, where these sculptors, these artists, were not trying to idealize women in any shape or form. They're very naturalistic, presenting women in all stages of life, including here, as from the Colima culture, a pregnant woman. And sculptures of pregnant women have been found numerous times in the Nayarit and Colima, but they're not idealized. They're all individualized, probably based on the person they're meant to represent. And this is amazing and great credit to the creators who may have been female themselves, because in ancient Mesoamerican, both male and female practiced the creation, practiced being were potters. Next slide, please. Child rearing is shown also very naturalistic. Also, unlike our first Nayarit examples, which are semi-hollow, this is a hollow example. And the creation of a hollow figure itself is rather difficult because they're not creating this in kilns. They're creating this by hand and then baking them in open fires. So as you look at sculptures, if you go into museums, either the UMFA or other museums around the world, and you look at these sculptures, look for where they've placed mouth hole, the holes, like sometimes it's in the mouth or through the nose or ears. This is very important because these are vents, so that, if you created something without a hole, the gases would build up in that figurine and would explode in the fire. But once again, very naturalistic. Here is a mother breastfeeding her baby, not idealized. Next slide, please. These works are not currently on display at the museum, but I include them because they show a family, mother, father, and mother, son, and father. The artist Horacio Rodriguez 3D scanned the son, and if you've seen any of his exhibitions, that son has played a prominent part. So I was very happy to have that he was able to work with the museum and with this collection. Next slide, please. Our last example in our museum is from Nayarit, and it's a hollow figure, and it shows an elder woman. And the way the artist did that is by using the white pigment on her hair. You can also see the artist is trying to accurately model what this woman looked like in real life. She has her hunchback and other aspects of aging. The hollow models of Nayarit and Colima are sometimes modeled so realistically and naturalistically that they've been studied for representations of disease in these ancient communities, including calcium deficiency, bone loss, protein deficiency. There's even a study that showed that in some of the figures, in the male and female figures, that some are exhibiting depression. And just that they are aware of this so early on is just a testament to these communities. Next slide, please. Now, we go 686 miles away for our last two pieces. Contemporary with the cultures flourishing in Nayarit and Colima was the culture we've now termed Remojadas for the major archaeological site near Veracruz. Now, unlike ancient West Mexico, which was somewhat isolated from other societies, the Remojadas culture was actually flourishing alongside the Gulf Coast between two major civilizations, Teotihuacan to the west, and then to the southeast, the Maya city-states. Next slide, please. Remojadas culture displayed, though, little influence or effect from these nearby cultures. The Remojadas people were probably descendants of the Olmec people who had been in the areas before 1000 BC. The Olmec were also the first group that we know of that were able to produce on a wide scale hollow figurine figures. Now, because the Remojadas culture is not following trends or copying motifs from Teotihuacan or the Maya, which we know more about, we are now left with more questions than answers. So this sculpture portrays a young woman, and we call it a young woman based on the comparisons from other similar type sculpture in the area. So the big question is, well, what was the purpose? Fertility? What was it meant to, or was it for enjoyment? This is what we're not able to answer. And while we do not know the answer, but you know the portrayal is very important, because look at the effort that went into the creation of this hollow figurine. The modeling of the face is breathtaking. And the distance, as you can see in this, as from the picture shows, the eyes look very real. And next slide, please. Now, if you noticed in the young woman's earrings and the ear spools, the last slide, the black outline in which you can see here, you're wondering maybe what it is. It's actually a form of liquid asphalt that artists in the region used. Here in this standing woman sculpture, you can see that the artist is using it to color the hair of the woman as well as the nipples on the breast. Once again, we're presented with the great mystery. Who is she? This pose that you see with her hands out, almost evoking the sculpture from Tlatelolco, is actually a quite common one in the Remojada sculpture for women. And it was leading archaeologists to believe that this woman is representing a type of priestess or even a goddess. But as you can see in the title, that an archaeologist who studied this piece back in the mid-70s before the museum acquired it, ventured to say this was an early image of the goddess that will be in the Aztec time called Cihuateteo. How she related to the women in fertility, our next speaker will fill you in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Luke. What an amazing presentation. I am originally from Mexico City. I have had the privilege to go to some of the museums to contemplate some of these objects. And the more I learn, the more questions I have. And precisely because what you said, the feelings that these objects reflect on their faces and body positions. And with that, Brenda will expand even more. Dr. Romero, welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Utah Museum of Fine Arts and Artes de México for this invitation. And thank you, Luke, for showing us all those wonderful pieces that we can see at the museum. Today, I will be talking to you about Mesoamerican perspectives on women and fertility. And as Luke already mentioned, Mesoamerica is the geographical area that includes Central Mexico and parts of Central America. Two indigenous groups that you probably heard about that lived in Mesoamerica are the Aztecs and the Mayans. But there were many other groups, including Purépechas, Huicholes, Coras, Otomís, etc. Next slide, please. Thank you. One large ethnic group that lived in Mesoamerica before the arrival of Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century was the Nahua people. We identify as Nahuas all speakers of the Nahuatl language, including the Aztecs. When Cortés and his men arrived to Mexico in the year 1519, this was the most widely spoken language in the area. Nowadays, it is spoken by about 1.5 million people in Mexico, in communities in the states of Oaxaca, Puebla, Veracruz, Tlaxcala, Tabasco, and others. And so most of the information that I will share with you today refers to practices and beliefs from the Nahua people. Some of them have remained the same from pre-Hispanic times to today, but others have changed or even disappeared. Next slide, please. So let's talk about my sources. Where can we find information about the beliefs and ideas related to women and fertility from the indigenous civilizations? And the answer is in the Mexican codices, and in singular is codex. What is this? So in ancient times, the Nahua people and other civilizations in Mesoamerica registered their information in pictorial form. So instead of using words or letters, they use images to portray, to register information. And they put them in these type of books that look like an accordion. There were codices used to register history. Some others used to have information related to the calendar, the rituals, the gods associated with different types of the year. There were others dedicated to keeping track of lineage of noble families, and there were even codices dedicated to register tribute, which nowadays would be the equivalent of taxes. Most of the original codices, the ones that were made before the conquest of Mexico, were destroyed either as a result of fire or war, or destroyed on purpose by the Spaniards. But many others were produced during the early colonial period. So that would be 16th and 17th centuries. These are fascinating documents that I began studying when I was in graduate school. And as you can see, I keep exploring them today. And so they are my main sources of information for today's presentation. Next slide, please. So what type of information did the Nahuas and other communities in Mesoamerica register in their codices related to women and fertility? Well, we have here examples from 3 different pictorial books. The first example is from the Florentine Codex. And in this pictorial book, we can find very detailed information about the various ceremonies that took place during a woman's pregnancy. These very elaborated ceremonies involve not only the expecting mother, but also her parents, the expecting father, his parents, and the midwife. In the Florentine Codex, we learned that the midwife was very involved during the entire pregnancy, obviously during the childbirth, but also after the baby was born. Another type of image that relates to women and fertility comes from the Codex Uchenutal. And in this case, we have the depiction of a noble woman giving birth to her first son. And as you can see, the son is painted still attached to the umbilical cord. Western culture usually gives more importance to the figure of the father, who's the head of the family, who's the baby's father, whose last name he's going to take. But in this case, you can see that for Mesoamerican cultures, in this case, sometimes the role of the mother was the one being highlighted, like in this case. Another example comes from Codex Mendoza. And in this codex, we have information about the various traditions that the Nahuas had after a baby was born. In this particular image, it tells us that 4 days after a baby was born, the baby was presented with miniature objects representing objects that he or she would use as an adult. So if it was a baby boy, he would be presented with a mini shield for war or mini weapons and mini shovel to work on the field. If it was a baby girl, she would be presented with a mini broom to clean the house or mini instruments for weeding. So from very early on, gender roles were established in the Nahua community. Next slide, please. Thank you. In Mesoamerica, women were associated with Mother Earth for their ability to create life. Some legends use symbolic depictions of the sexual act and childbirth to explain the creation of gods, places, or rulers. For example, we have this first image from Codex Selden. And on the right-hand side of the image, you can see 2 gods. You can see them upside down. One is God, one death. The other one is one earthquake. And they are casting spears into this hill. So symbolically, they are impregnating this hill. So it's a symbolic way of representing a sexual act. Then as a result of this act, Lord 11 Water is born. And as you can see on the left-hand side of that same picture, he's still attached to the umbilical cord of that hill. You might have heard that in the Aztec culture, Coatlicue was a very important goddess, the mother goddess, the mother of all gods. But in the Mexican codices, we have many other goddesses that are associated with specific aspects related to women and fertility. And one of these goddesses is Chicomecuatl. And this one is the goddess of fertility, of nourishment, agriculture, in other words, Mother Earth. And in this first image from the Florentine Codex, you can see her standing up, holding 2 ears of corn in one hand, that, as you know, corn is the most important source of nourishment for Mesoamerican indigenous people. And in the other hand, she has a sunflower shield. Now, the second image that we have here from the Florentine Codex is very interesting because the same goddess is presented again with the 2 ears of corn and with the shield, but she's depicted in a birthing position. So it looks like she's giving birth to all these crops. You see all these baskets with crops underneath her. So again, we have all these symbolic images that have to do with the sexual act and childbirth in these codices. Next slide, please. Thank you. For the Nahua people, when a woman was giving birth, she was between life and death. This moment of giving birth and being literally between life and death was seen by the Nahuas as a parallel to when men went to war. For them, a woman giving birth was like a warrior. She could come out triumphant with a prize, with a baby, or she could be defeated and die. In this culture, women who died during childbirth and men who died in war had the highest honors, and they were thought to be together in the afterlife. The spirits of these 2 very honorable groups were believed to be the ones guiding the sun every day from east to west. So it was a big deal. The goddess of childbirth was Cihuacuatl, who, as you can see, is ready for war. She has a weapon and a shield. And again, this idea of giving birth, like going to war, being a warrior, being between life and death. Now, the spirits of women who died during childbirth were called Cihuateteo. And as you can see in these sculptures that come from the Nahuas, these figures are wearing a skirt, they're in a kneeling position, and their faces look like a skull. It was believed that at night, sometimes you could hear the crying or the screaming of these fallen women warriors. And there is a theory that with time, this myth of the Cihuateteo was transformed into what we call nowadays in Mexican pop culture, the legend of La Llorona, the weeping woman who's on the streets crying for her children. Next slide, please. Thank you. Finally, I'd like to talk to you about a type of steam bath or sauna that was very popular in Mesoamerica, and actually is one of those practices that continues until this day. You can still find a temazcal in some places in Mexico. And this was a very small place, a small construction made out of stone or adobe, where steam was produced by pouring water into hot stones. Besides steam, the body of the person inside the temazcal was rubbed with plants or herbs. And this was an important place for pregnant women. Pregnant women will frequently go to inside the temazcal, also after childbirth, and it was even recommended for women who were struggling getting pregnant. The temazcal was a place of healing and purification, but it was also perceived as a type of womb, like a baby, as a place of rebirth. Like a baby being born, the individual coming out of the temazcal will emerge head first, crawling, like being reborn. So there's all this symbolism. The goddess of the temazcal is Temazcaltequi. And as you can see in these two images from Codex Tudela and Codex Machiavecchiano, her image was put on the temazcal. She is usually presented with a shield in one hand and with herbs on the other one, like this image from the Florentine Codex. But very interestingly, in this second image that we have of Goddess Temazcaltequi from Codex Borbonicus, she's portrayed in a birthing position. She's giving birth and making reference to this process of being reborn when a person goes inside the temazcal. Next slide, please. That concludes my part of the presentation. Thank you very much, and I will welcome your comments or questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Dr. Romero. It resonates with me, what you just said, and I love how you put it, that we as women become warriors. You know, fertility and motherhood put us in that position. I never thought of that. It's very, very powerful. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm in love with Chicomecoatl now, giving birth to corn. You know, since corn is our favorite source of food for the Americas. And with that, I would love to give the word to writer Aida Salazar. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Waiting for my screen to pop up. Ah, okay. Can we go back? I don't see myself. Is it possible to be spotlighted? Am I spotlighted? Am I on? I don't know.
We can see you, Aida.
Oh, you can. Okay. I just want to make sure that the light is behind me. I didn't know. Sorry, I just saw Fanny. Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. This is really exciting conversation that is so long overdue. And thank you to Artes de México, Utah, and to the Utah Museum of Fine Arts. So I'm here to talk about The Moon Within, La Luna Dentro de Mí, which is this book here that I wrote. And instead of letting me tell you what it's about, I have a little video that I'd like to share with youth because this book was written for middle grade readers. So if we could play that video, please. All right, thank you so much. Can you please give me the next slide? Thank you. So that book is essentially for youth, for ages anywhere from 10 to 12 years old. And, you know, it's a book that it's sort of unlike others out there in terms of the information that it provides. There are lots of books that talk about menstruation, that talk about, you know, what it's like in a very nonfiction sort of way, but there are hardly any books that address it when it comes to linking the Mexican or Chicana experience with Mesoamerica and the traditions that come from our indigenous ancestors and our indigenous people who continue to practice these practices today. And so one of the moon goddesses that was very, very inspiring to me was Coyolxauhqui. And you see her here on the left. Coyolxauhqui is actually a disc that is about 10 feet wide, and it was found at the base of Templo Mayor in Mexico City, right at the Zócalo, which is the town square in the center of Mexico City, right next to the cathedral, which was a very nasty habit of the conquerors who destroyed indigenous temples and built their temples on top of them. So Coyolxauhqui was there, and she is the goddess of the moon, and she has a very particular myth, as do all goddesses, and which I won't get into, but this is a representation on the right by Irene Perez, a modern day version of Coyolxauhqui. Her story is very inspiring to many of us, including myself, and it was the first goddess that I discovered in my act of reclaiming what it meant to be a menstruator and to have this lineage of a connection with the moon through ceremony and through spiritual understanding. So next slide, please. So here are a few other moon goddesses that were very inspiring to me. Xochiquetzal is a moon goddess, but she's also a goddess of sexual pleasure without necessarily conceiving, which I thought is really kind of empowering, and it's kind of a feminist perspective, I would say, on female power and female autonomy and pleasure. And Xochiquetzal comes from the Mexica people, the Aztec or the Nahuatl people. And Mesli also is another deity who, and I forget what codex, probably Brenda can tell us. This is Mesli, and she is represented with a rabbit in the center of the moon. And on the next image over is Ixchel. And Ixchel is not from the Mexica or the Nahua people, but from the Maya tradition. And she is the goddess of fertility. She is the goddess of childbirth and, of course, the moon. And so why it's so important to, why are these moon goddesses revered across the Americas? It's because, like the moon, women or menstruators menstruate 28 to 29 days in 29-day cycles. And, you know, people have revered the moon for as long as there have been people, as long as we have been able to admire the moon. And so my writing of this book, based on these ideas and these goddesses and my ancestral lineage, is came because I wanted to reconnect. I wanted to rewrite the story that we had been told, that menstruation is dirty, right? Modern day history will tell us that throughout the world, that people view menstruation as a curse, as a negative thing. But what I was trying to do with this book was to rewrite our conceptions and our notions of what that is, and into one that was celebratory. And next slide, please. So I wrote The Moon Within, thinking about Xochiquetzal as the main character is kind of like a representation of my main character, who is blossoming. She's beginning to kind of feel feelings. She's exploring her flor, her flower, her down there girl parts, as her mama calls it. She is feeling for the first time sexual attraction, and of course she is about to get her period. And Xochipilli is her twin, is Xochiquetzal's twin spirit. They are Xochipilli is known for being the god of the arts, a male god, and represents those, or is accepting of those who are queer, and all along Xochipilli and Xochiquetzal is the flower. What unites them is the flower, and the flower, not only in the Mesoamerican traditions but across the world, is a symbol of blossoming, of fertility, and you will see them. Xochi, the word Xochi means flower, and they both of their names start with flower. Flower prince and flower forgetting, I'd have to check my notes, but Xochiquetzal. Oh, she is like a flower, soft feather. That's her name. So anyway, please, next slide. So what does all of that have to do with modern day, right? These ceremonies have survived despite colonization that has tried to erase them, has tried to shut them down, has persecuted people for practicing these ceremonies, and it's been a form of resistance for practitioners of moon ceremonies to continue to pass down this knowledge word of mouth. And I looked to my elders, and I created a ceremony for my daughter, and that's what you see here. That's my daughter being crowned in one of the rituals. Inside the ceremony, there are several rituals that one does for the child who's coming of age. And this one's called the flower ritual. Okay, next slide, please. And this one this is just a kind of a wide shot of what one of the practices. The elder was saging those coming inside the circle, and you see the women sitting in circle who have already been saged, and in the distance you can see the moon hut where the menstruating girl who's being celebrated sits and is honored. So next slide, please. And this is a close-up of it. Of course, the ceremony happens by the light of the full moon, and an altar is created, and you can see the altar in front of this row of girls. The younger girls sit on mats, and the main moon girl, she sits inside the moon lodge that's lit up. And there's an elder here giving her advice. It's part of a rite of passage to instruct girls in the ways of menstruators. Next slide, please. And this is the fire tenders. Fire is a central part of a moon ceremony. And you'll see, possibly you'll be able to make out there are little stones around the fire, and those stones are 13 stones that represent the 13 moons in the year. So the moon keeps coming back in all of it. Not only are we doing it beneath the full moon, but we're also doing it symbolically. Next slide, please. Yes, next slide, thank you. So one of the most kind of revealing and incredible things that happened to me in the research of this book is that as I had already finished writing the book, it was going to print. I had a friend who is a scholar of Mesoamerican languages, Dr. David Bowles, who I reached out to read for accuracy. And after he read it, he said, "This is lovely. And you know what? I translated this poem called A Flower Song for Maidens Coming of Age. And it's actually a codex called the Songs of the Spalche. It's a series of poetry that the Spalche wrote. And it's credited, I think it was written in 1440 before European conquest. And so David allowed us to use his translation in this book. And so this poem that has been in obscurity for very, very long time is now published widely in this book, and young people and all readers actually have an opportunity to see it. And if I may, I'd love to read it to you, because I imagine that you can't see it, because it's really beautiful. I think it's an affirmation of the honoring of the rite of passage of menstruation. A flower song for maidens coming of age. The beautiful, beautiful moon has risen above the woods, tracing her bright path across the heavens. Suspended, she pours light upon the woods, the earth entire. A breeze blows sweetly, carrying perfumed scents. The moon reaches her zenith, her glow silvering the world. Joy sings out within every good soul. We reach the center, the womb of the forest, utter stillness. No one will see what we have come to do. We have brought flowers, lol nikte, frangipani blossoms, lol chukun, dragon's blood blooms, lol ul, dog jasmine petals. We have brought copal incense and wild bamboo, a tortoise shell and crystal dust. We have brought new cotton thread and gourds for our spindles, a large, lovely flint and a counterweight, new needlework and a sacrificial bird. New sandals too, everything new, even the thongs we use to tie our hair back, so the old woman, teacher and guide, can anoint our necks with nectar as she instructs us in the ways of women. We stand at the heart of the forest, beside the song pool, waiting for Venus, the smoking star, to glimmer above the trees. Remove your clothes, let down your hair, bask in the moonlight, naked as the day of your birth, virgins, maidens, women. Songs of Despache. How beautiful. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So another offering that I gave in my book to young menstruators is a cycle tracker. You know, before, if I, as I understand it from my elders, is that there was such a connection with the moon that they knew that if on the full moon, you know, certain people in the community were menstruating and other people were menstruating at other parts of the cycle of the moon. And often it happens during the new moon or the full moon. And so this I gave to menstruators as a way for them to not only track where the moon is in the sky, but how when they menstruate syncs up and how that dances together with the moon. All right, next slide, please. Okay, and so this is just resources, and I'm going to put in the chat a link to the teacher's guide for my book for those of you who might be educators and or those who want more resources for the you know, exploring menstruation and all of this. I'll have to point you to one book that's on here. It's called Voices from Our Ancestors. And in that book, it's a collection of Latine people who are reclaiming these ancestral traditions or rewriting them or reinventing them as a way to heal from colonization, from what colonization has taken away from us. So next slide. Yeah. And last slide, please. That's my website. I'm happy to be in conversation with you all today. And if you have questions, I'm right here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aida. This is very powerful. I have to say that in the last few days, I've been having long conversations about this subject that for many of us, because of our culture and not necessarily the Mexican culture or the Latino culture, as you said, it's an issue, it's a subject of taboo, right? We are not taught to be warriors, as Dr. Romero said. We are not taught to be in connection with our nature and the moon. And this is beautifully said. So I thank you so much for your perspective. And with that, I would like to open questions for everyone in our audience to our presenters. Let's see. You can type your question in the chat.
I have a question for Dr. Romero. I just want to see if you could elaborate a little bit about Chihuahuateteo, because I've also heard this how she's linked, but I heard a little bit that the genesis of her is that that she revived after 4 days of death and would appear at the crossroads. Is that something that you'd heard?
So Chihuahuateteo was not a goddess per se. Chihuahuateteo was the name given to women who died during childbirth. Right. And it was a big event. When a woman died during childbirth, all the midwives and other women from the town will line up to like a wake for her body, and then they would protect the body of this dead woman for days, because it was believed, there was popular belief that if you went and cut a finger or some hair or a hand, it was like a great good luck charm. So even warriors wanted to get a piece of that because they believe that having a piece of that now holy woman, Cihuateteo, they could never lose in battle, right? Or they could nothing bad was going to happen to them. And so, and like I said, they were believed to be in the afterlife with the warriors. So it was a high honor for women who died during childbirth.
And I've also read that the women were buried with the warriors versus cremated, that it was a common practice to be cremated for just the standard regular person, but that women who died in childbirth and warriors were buried in the fetal position. And I think that Cihuateteos were also buried at the base of a sacred tree.
Yes, and that's why the body was protected. So the midwives were almost like soldiers protecting the body of these holy women. Yes. So they would not be taken away by others in the city. Do we have any questions? Because I had a comment for Aida too.
Yes, I just want to read this comment from Agnes to Aida. How cool that you have connected moon cycles with menstrual cycles. I never thought of it that way. Nonetheless, it was more fun having a full moon overhead than having my periods for decades. Thank you, Agnes.
That's interesting. That's interesting that you would say that, Agnes. And I think that kind of speaks to the loss of wisdom that women and menstruators have had to experience. And that is that, you know, in the Americas, there's a lot of medicine, a lot of herbal medicine, and a lot of tricks of the trade that would teach us how to deal with menstruation. And also, you know, our modern diets also disrupt our menstruations, and being disconnected with the moon also disrupts our menstruations. And so there are a lot of forces that I think our modern periods have suffered, I think, from not having this connection to the moon and not having this connection to the plant medicine and the wisdom that the women and menstruators have passed on. So here's hoping that if you still menstruate, that you have a more pleasant one, and that you seek out some of these incredible recipes and wisdom.
Thank you, Aida. Dr. Romero, go ahead.
Yeah, so when I was listening to Aida talk about Xochiquetzal, who is the goddess of like beauty and sex, but sex for fun, right? I was thinking of when I was reviewing some of my sources for this presentation, one of the ceremonies, the Aztecs, the Nahuas were very ceremonial. They had ceremonies for everything. And so one of the ceremonies that they had was for a young woman coming of age. So after she had her period, right? They don't say it specifically, but is when she is not a girl anymore and is a woman now. And so they have this speech that they give to her. And they were very practical, very realistic, right? And so some of the things that they tell this young girl, the parents, is you are not gonna play with your friends anymore. You're going to work with your mother. You're gonna learn what she does, and eventually you will probably get married and have children. And you're gonna suffer, but enjoy the pleasures of this world. And some of these pleasures are sex and drinking. So they literally say it, drink some pulque once in a while and have sexual pleasure. And so this is something that I got reminded of when I was listening to your presentation.
You know, in the Aztec danza community, modern day Aztec danza community in California, in Watsonville, they started this process, this ceremony called Shilonen, and it's a 1-year process of coming of age, and it's not necessarily tied to menstruation, but that rite of passage of becoming a child, from going being a child to becoming a woman, and they're teaching them all sorts of like empowering things. And I don't know if they're teaching them how to drink or encouraging them how to drink, but I think you know, it's beautiful to have that continue to happen this day.
There is one question, and this question also leads me to this comment. As I was thinking about the creation of this class because of the objects that Luke explained, it came to me the thought, first of all, of how we perceive our cosmos as a female figure, right? And it makes me think on the projects that I've been working on, not only women being as a representation of fertility to give birth to humans, but when we talk about the cosmography of the idea that the female is the creator of the world. And it made me think a lot about this conversation that I had with one friend of mine who is Maya Indigenous. And she, in one of the ceremonies that we were having, after the ceremony, there were some seeds on the floor, and she took the time to pick up each one of the seeds instead of getting the broom, right? In our Western culture, we see this, you know, this is just a part of the remaining of a ceremony and move on. And she took the time to pick up every seed. It made me think how she's connected to the origin of life. And she said that, you know, this seed is life. This seed is one stalk of corn that will produce probably 10 corn ears, and they will be enough for our food. And it would really transform the idea of how we see women. So the question here is, it says, the history you have all presented is one of the glories of female fertility. Do you know if there is also goddesses for women who don't plan to have children and for women who are not longer fertile?
Well, Brenda, do you have an answer for that?
In the Nawa society, which is the one that I've studied the most, women were naturally expected to become mothers, since there was this belief that if you were to die during childbirth, that was almost if we translate that into Christian belief, like becoming a saint. So that was the norm. However, there were women who were concubines. There were women who were not wives of had children, but that was not the norm.
So in that book, in my resources, there's a book called Voices from Our Ancestors. And I believe there are ceremonies in there that were created by modern day Chicanas who didn't have children and who created ceremonies to kind of enter their crone period or their you know, or to just to honor the fact that they never had children. So you might want to look at that book. Because, you know, I think that if for me, my relationship to goddesses and to this history is one that has to serve as inspiration, and trying to reclaim it from these broken bits and pieces of information, these rewritten codexes often, you know, we have to kind of be guided by the truth of our own hearts and our own spirits to heal from some of this stuff. So that's how I use and am inspired by this knowledge. And every time I learn more, you know, it gives me more inspiration to heal.
I think of the relevance of these objects now. I hope people feel the curiosity to come back to the museum and look at these objects in a completely different perspective. As we created this class, this community conversation, I thought of, what is relevant and why are those objects relevant to nowadays? Those are not necessarily objects of the past for what they represent and for the value that is given to women and to our cultures, right? So I see Dr. Romero and Aida Salazar as great ambassadors to educate and to empower women in a way that you might be fertile or not, but fertility, it's a much broader concept of life as we see the creation of this cosmos. And then I see here one more question. Do you know of modern or contemporary artists, creatives, who are exploring women and fertility and some of the same concepts that you have shared with us today in either Mesoamerica or even locally?
Yes, I do. Brenda, you want to go? Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. One of the most beautiful things that I love about Instagram, and there aren't very many things, but one of the most beautiful things of Instagram is this hashtag called menstruation or menstruation art, or you can do it in any language and make the hashtag in any language, and you will see in Spanish, Arte de Menstruación, you will see art, all of people creating art. There are people who take their menstrual blood and make paintings. There are people who redesign vulvas and fallopian tubes and and uteruses and or uterusi, or what is the plural of uteruses? So yeah, so I think if you do a small search, you can on Instagram, you'll see lots and lots of images, and it's pretty awesome.
Yes, I also would like to mention there's an amazing artist here in Salt Lake City, Utah. It's called Veronica Perez. She has been an inspiration for the creation of the art for our Born from Corn project, where she connects the idea of the cosmos with giving birth to Milpa, right? And so you can find her also in Instagram. And there are many artists, actually, Vicky Lowe, Flora Familiar. There is one more question that I would like to present here. Some of the old figures look like they were models for Picasso. A Spaniard reconsidering the culture they tried to conquer. It's a comment. But I did find another question right here. What is the correlation between all these wonderful goddesses and the Virgin of Guadalupe? Great question.
Virgin of Guadalupe is seen as a result of this syncretism, right? When the Spaniards came to Mexico, they forced the natives to convert to Christianism. Now, the indigenous population did not necessarily from one day to the other switch their belief system, their gods, etc. They transform and they said, okay, now Coatlicue is this one, and now Tlaloc is this one, right? And so they just gave different names to these new images, religious images, religious characters that were forced for them. And so to answer that question, the word that was used for goddesses in general was Tonantzin. And so Tonantzin is the Nahua word associated with the Virgin of Guadalupe. So it's also like the goddess, there was this relation between the old beliefs and these new beliefs that were imposed to them into the figure of the Virgin of Guadalupe.
That's interesting. See, I've read something different, which is I'm curious to see what you think about this. So what I've read is that it's actually that La Virgen de Guadalupe is a derivative of Coatlicue, and that the name came from Coatlicue, Guadalupe. And so that's why Guadalupe is a name that you don't see any other place in the Americas, because she came from Coatlicue. And I don't know, have you heard that? Have you read that?
It's definitely one of those figures that has lots of stories. There are many versions of that. Mm-hmm. The first indigenous narrative that talks about that is in Nahuatl is what's the name? Nican Mopoa. I think that's the name. I can tell you later, but is basically the one that tells the story that is traditionally told in the Christian faith about this indigenous man going to this hill and seeing this apparition, blah, 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 blah. And so that that's considered the main source of information for the Virgin of Guadalupe, and then all their different theories, stories came from that. So we don't know 100%, but yes, there are many theories about that story.
Thank you so much, Dr. Romero, Aida, Luke, for your amazing perspective, deep perspective, as we discuss these beautiful objects that represent so much for everyone, I hope now. And with this, I would like to end our community conversation. Thank you to the Museum of Fine Arts for the safe space, for the open conversation, and for the moment of reflection as we learn all together. Thank you all.
Thank you, Fanny. I just would like to thank our presenters for the wonderful conversation and their incredible passion and knowledge on this topic. Thank you to our amazing collaborator and partner, Artes de México in Utah, and Fanny Blauer. Thank you to Maggie Treeley, who worked behind the scenes at UMFA to collaborate on this beautiful event and to produce it. And thanks to you all for joining us this evening for your great engagement and your questions. We hope you'll join us for the next Mexican Art and History class. It'll be next month in September, on Tuesday, September 21st at 6:30. And the topic of that class is Arte Gráfico Popular, or Art Printmaking Collective. We thank you all again. Take care.